Well, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls. My name is Christine. I'm going to give you a little bit of commentary for the next 20 minutes or so while you are on board the Morana. We welcome you. Go grab a coffee or something stronger to drink and something to eat, and just sit back and relax and enjoy the scenery. A little bit of housekeeping, social distancing, I'm sure you know all about that. I think you're all doing the right thing. There are hand sanitizers around too, so feel free. There are life jackets stowed in these lockers just behind me. In the unlikely event of an emergency, only take instruction from the captain or from the crew. The upper deck is open, there's no seating up there, but if you want a bit of a higher view, feel free to make your way up there. Down the back, and the stern is open, and of course the bow area as well. So we're making our way out of Mason Cove. So this was once considered to be the front door to Port Arthur, and Eagle Hawk Neck was the back door. That is because there were no roads down here until the early 1900s. Everything that arrived here and left here did so by ship. Shipping was a very big industry in Van Diemen's Land throughout the 1800s. Not just for whaling, but they also needed to build patrol boats, all sorts of vessels to move around the coastline. If you look out the port side, you're looking into an area that was once Port Arthur's dockyards. Significant in the history of the British Empire, in fact, because convict labour was not only building the docks, they were also building boats. Most unusual. It only happened at Sarah Island on the west coast and Cockatoo Island in Sydney Harbour. Stayed open the dockyards for around 14 and a half years, and convict labour, they produced over 16 large decked vessels. The largest, the 300-ton barkentine, 150-ton schooners, and a couple of 150 or so open rowing boats, a bit like today's surf life-saving vessels. They were used as support boats for the whaling industry, but also for the movement of goods and people around more sheltered waters, such as this harbour. Swinging around to have another look in there. At any one time there would have been around 80 convicts working neck deep in those leg irons in that area, building magnificent boats. And there is a convict vessel on display in the Maritime Museum in Hobart. You can wander around into the dockyards. There's a couple of information boards there. You can have a better look around, and you get another perspective, another view of the settlement from that area. The cottages, the one on the right is called Sunnybanks, and that was home to the master shipwright and his family. The one on the left, Lith End, that was the Clerk of Works house, and then it turned into a blacksmith's workshop, hence all the chimneys. Sunnybanks is actually the oldest wooden structure that's still surviving here at Port Arthur. So it's a very good earn for the government boat building. We've got free trees, free resources, and of course free labour. There's a good markup for the government in that exercise, in that business exercise. But what happened was that the Free Shipwrights of Hobart Town bitterly complained. They were of course unable to compete with the cost of the boats coming out of here. So the government, in its great wisdom, shut down an extremely successful business operation, and that enabled the Free Shipwrights of Hobart to once again prosper. They did go on to do minor repairs on boats, and they also built the hull of a steamship called the Derwent. It's truly a magnificent harbour. It's one of the largest natural harbours in the Southern Hemisphere. In fact, there's more water in this harbour than in Sydney Harbour. There are no spits or sandbars. It drops away to 16 metres in this area and up to 45 metres in depth in the outer harbour. That's of course where the largest cruise ships would have dropped anchor once upon a time. Gives you some idea of how deep the waters around here are. During the convict era, well, the free people would have used the harbour to maybe do a bit of boating, hold regattas, do a little bit of swimming and so forth. Convicts used to gather up the seaweed. They could mix that with the night soil and they produce an excellent fertiliser for their gardens. And then there were select officers and convicts who could gather some of the shellfish, abalone, oysters, mussels and so on. They had permission to gather up those that shellfish from the shore, from the rocks. So off to starboard now is Carnarvon, gorgeous little settlement, residential and holiday destination for many. It was once known as Brick Bay, the whole bay with Brick Point in the middle, called Brick Bay and Brick Point because they were making bricks in that area, including the bricks for the penitentiary. The penitentiary used around 1 million bricks, nearly 1 million bricks in its construction. For a very long time it was the largest building in Australia. It was a bit too bad that the convicts mixed the clay with seawater, and that made the bricks very fragile over time. And of course, if you go through the penitentiary, you'll see the results of that. During floods and so on, the walls are somewhat crumbly, hence those big girders, steel girders on the inside just to brace the building and keep it above the water table. Directly ahead of us is Point Puer, P-U-E-R, it's a Latin word for youth or boy. It's the site of the first boys' prison, purpose-built boys' prison to be set up in the British Empire. These boys were brought directly out here to Point Puer, where their older compatriots, well, they were secondary offenders from any Australian colony. The boys came directly here. So these boys, primarily from the slums back in Britain, have a history of crime. You know, they've been working in gangs and syndicates probably from the age of 3 or 4. The age of 7 back in Britain in those days, you were considered to be an adult. 8, you could be hanged for your crimes. At 9, you could be transported. So look, it doesn't look too bad out there, but let me assure you, it was bleak and windswept. There was no fresh water. They chopped down all the trees out here to make room for their trade huts and for their little prisons or their school rooms. So you know, it was a tough existence. That little beach off to starboard there is where the boys would have started their day. The ablutions block. Any one time there would have been 800 or 900 boys in this area, along with just as many soldiers and convict overseers to try and teach them some trades if they showed any aptitude, bookbinding, bootmaking, whatever. But most of them they were just very good at nicking things, and they were never going to learn anything else. Stayed open for about over 14 years, and in that time 3,500 boys passed through the prison. When they became a certain age, they would then graduate onto the main settlement. If you look up through the trees, you'll probably see some remains of some of their buildings. Schoolroom, try and teach them how to read and write. They were all undernourished, undersized. They were not fit for physical labour, so the idea was to try and teach them something. Like an early trade school. The British thought this was a terrific success, so they built a boys' prison on the Isle of Wight called Parkhurst, and they eventually closed this one down. So you're aware that we've moved into the outer harbour. You can feel the motion of the Mariah changing a bit deeper out here. I do urge you to keep an eye out for any dolphins. We had a lovely pod of dolphins following us up the harbour, not last cruise, the cruise before. So it's always worth trying to spot them. So those boys would have done a little bit of illegal fishing around here, trying to hide from the soldiers. gather up some of those oysters and so on for themselves. Try not to get caught. But if they did get caught, they didn't care too much. A couple of days in solitary, it was better than having to go to work in the quarries. You can see the blade just there, about to take some of those hikers over to the Three Capes track. Get a bit of a briefing. Directly ahead of us is the opening to the harbour, of course, and you know that there is nothing under. I know you know because you're Tasmanian. There's nothing between here and Antarctica, or the Antarctic shelf, 2,500 kilometres away. If you turn right at West Arthur Head, it's not too far back to Hobart Town, maybe 3 or 4 hours in this vessel. In the day, it could have taken 16 hours sailing time to get around to Hobart. Actually, you can see on those sandstone cliffs there, that's where the quarry areas were located. The boys on Point Poor would have cut some of the blockwork for the church and for other buildings, and possibly done a lot of the woodwork, the shingle roofs and some of the internal features as well. They'll be having a good ride on Glade. By the look of it. So as we swing around and move up the harbour, of course that's the Tasman National Park. Almost ahead of us. And that is home to the Three Capes Walk. If you've ever been out in that area, those dolerite cliffs, 300 metres they soar above sea level. Some of the most magnificent cliffs you'll see anywhere in the southern hemisphere. The national park, well, it's covered in pretty ordinary tea tree. Convicts didn't need to touch that because they were sport for choice on the main settlement with those magnificent eucalyptus trees. So pretty much everyone would have looked at this view on the way in to the harbour, into Port Arthur, except for the convicts, because they would have been below deck in leg irons. Wouldn't have seen anything. In reality, that view has not changed for hundreds of years. Certainly get a sweeping view of the harbour and you get some idea of how large it is. Off in the distance is the head of Long Bay, so named because it's very long. It goes all the way down to the lavender farm. And you might just be able to make out some salmon pens, commercial salmon pens at the head of Long Bay. I think that's exactly where those dolphins were making for when they breathed in here. Hoping for a breakout. There were areas around there. One of them was a little bay called Ladies Bay. That's where the free women of Port Arthur would have been rowed around with a convict crew. and there they could just have a bit of a paddle in the water, the cool water on a good day. But certainly they wanted to be well away from any unwelcome stares of the convicts. Ladies' Bay. And there were areas there too. One of them was called Garden Bay. That's where the convicts had their gardens, maybe growing some vegetables and so forth in that area. So every bit of land was put to good use. Good idea. Hang on to your phone though. Just watch the wind. So we're coming around, if you look out to the port side, there's that little island, Ile de Mort, it was named. Of course, that's a fancy name. Translated, that means Isle of the Dead. The convicts simply called it Dead Island. That is because it is Port Arthur's cemetery. Most people who died in Port Arthur are buried out there on the island. It's first identified by the Reverend Manton in 1833 as a secure and undisturbed resting place where convicts could lay side by side to await the resurrection. That sounds charming, doesn't it? Sounds lovely. But Reverend Manton also went on to decree that no convict was worthy of a marker on his grave. They were sinners in life and shall be forgotten in death. As a result, it's very hard to be accurate as to how many convicts are buried out there. They're buried on the cold windward side of the island in unmarked graves. Conservatively, 800 to 900 convicts. Some 200 to 300 military, free people, important people, women, children, buried on the high ground. And it was a lot to do with class as well, status. Looking down on the most wretched class of all convicts, the criminal class. Sad irony is that the free people have beautiful headstones, expertly carved by the convict stonemasons. Actually, the island is a place where you can go on a walking tour. It's about 40 minutes with a guide. You get to hear some of the stories stories of the people who are buried out there on the island. Unfortunately, it's just closed. It's almost due to reopen, I think, within a week or two.